no, there was reality there. My father particularly, I could see in him a very patient man. And I guess in those troubling teenage years, I looked to him and I said, you know, he's found what's real, and I want the same.
Well, that's great.
So that was very, very encouraging.
So it became personal for you. It wasn't just a family faith, but it became something that you owned yourself.
Yes. Actually, at the age of 5, I received Christ as my Savior.
Wow.
Probably,
and you remember that?
I do very much. Yes, it was with my mom and dad. I was actually crying going to sleep one night, and my sister said, "Well, what's wrong?" And I told her that I wasn't sure I'd go to heaven, and so she said, "Well, we better go talk to Mom and Dad," and we did. And about 2 years later, probably gained the assurance of my salvation. I'm not, God
That's
knows,
fantastic.
just when faith really kicked in there. But certainly, I received Him at age 5, but probably had to understand a little more, and so at age 7 I actually, from that point on, I've never had any doubt whatever that I'd go to heaven if I died. So
that's fantastic. Yeah. That's great. Now it's interesting because you've had such a, as I say, dynamic ministry, and yet you didn't really start out in pastoral ministry or even teaching ministry. No. You went into business. So tell us a little bit about how that transpired. Why do you think the Lord led you on that path in business before ministry, or was it just something that had to be worked out in your life?
Actually, I was in business, and I was doing a line of wood products, cabinet work, that sort of thing. Actually, a big part of the business developed into doing sporting goods, things like balance beams, you know, like they use in the Olympics, that sort of thing. I made hundreds of those, I guess. Wow. And then one of the big contracts we had is a very basic thing, but it was making wooden spools to wind rubber hose on, and that was it put money in our pocket and fed our family, so it was okay. But all of a sudden, one day, that contract was gone, and it was interesting, the timing, because we had just moved into the home that my parents had lived in. There was a shop out behind where I was doing my work, and we lived more in the town of Brantford, Ontario, actually. And then all of a sudden, well, they said they'd like to move to town and wondered if we wanted to buy the property. Well, 2 days later, I lost this contract. Amazing. And I thought, well, the timing was very interesting on it. So I said, okay, God, what have you got in mind? You must have something here. And it was in that process that I got into the wood carvings. That took up probably the next 10 years of our business, and we got very, very busy doing that. So you actually did carvings as a business? Yes, very much so. Oh, wow. Yes, it was full-time. I mean, these are beautiful ones that you've got here today with you, and I didn't realize that was actually part of the business. Yes, we did that. We sold across Canada, some in the U.S., and some as far away as Australia and England, things like that. But yeah, it was a great time of my life. I enjoyed it. I felt so fortunate because I was one of those guys that was doing what he enjoyed, and actually we were making a living at it. Not a great living. I mean, but most artists were starving to death, and we were at least feeding our families. So I felt good about that. Well, that's great. Now you've been out of that for quite a time as a business. Oh, yes. Do you still do a lot of carving just for your own recreational health? I really don't. Interesting. I enjoyed it very much when I was in it, and I know I had some very artsy type friends who said, "Al, if you leave that, you know, it's a chunk of your life that's going to be missing. You'll die inside. You'll die up inside." Yeah, it hasn't been the case at all. God's replaced it with something. God gives, God takes away, and so that was fine with me. You're sculpting lives. Absolutely. You're like you no longer fish for fish. You'll fish for men. Now you're sculpting the lives of people. Well, and I often tell people that instead of being the master carver, I'm just the tool in the hand of the master carver. Oh, wow, that's neat. And so he's doing amazing work in individuals' lives and churches and communities and so on. So yeah, well, we'll get into some of that work in a little bit, but I'm curious also, do you think that time in business has served you well for this ministry? You know, a lot of people go into ministry at a young age, in their early 20s, and never have that experience in the business world. And how do you feel that has helped you in ministry, or has it? It definitely has. In fact, I've often said that some of the best people in ministry are people who have had experience in business. Because in business, I had 3 small children, my wife and I, Mary and I, and we you have to figure out how to make a dollar. And if you just sit around and do nothing, you're not going to make any money. You starve to death.
Right.
And so you have to learn to produce in order to feed your family.
There has
Well,
to be
you
a
get into
fruit.
ministry, you get the concept that you've got to, this has to be productive. We have to see something come out of this to make it worthwhile. So it definitely serves that.
Well, that's interesting. Now, you had a fairly interesting experience out of your teaching with Campus Crusade for Christ. That sounds like perhaps it was a little bit of a new chapter or a turning point in your life. Tell us a little bit about that stage of your life.
All right. Well, I was raised in a good church and certainly knew the basic truths of the gospel. The Spirit-filled life, though, was a mystery to me, and I was frustrated in those early years. Business was doing well sometimes it wasn't doing well. It was, how business goes up and down. And through that period of time, I became very frustrated and began to say, God, is this really what the Christian life was meant to be? At the same time, I was reading through the scriptures, the book of Acts, for example, and I thought, what's changed? Why isn't the church today what it was back then?
Right.
I know history changes things, but why? What has changed? And I began to realize that so much of what was happening in Christendom today was really ineffective. People were, and pastors and leaders were busy, running, doing all kinds of good things. Nothing wrong with what they were doing, but was it really producing the kind of results that we wanted? I looked at my own life, and I wasn't any better. I wasn't pointing at anybody else. I was saying, God, what's wrong with me? What am I missing? And it was through that process of searching that God actually brought me across the ministry of Campus Crusade, where I learned two basic things. I learned to walk in the power of the Spirit, and I learned to share my faith, and to be able to share my faith in the power of the Spirit, so that it wasn't just a big argument.
How would you sum up the difference between living your Christian life as faithfully as you could before that, and then living in that phrase, in the power of the Spirit? How would you sum up the difference?
Okay, I had 5 men working with me at the time in our business, and we would. This isn't smart, but it was reality. We would take a coffee break mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and sometimes mid-morning we'd get talking, and I'd be witnessing to them.
Right.
Actually, I was much more knowledgeable of Scripture. They knew nothing, and I knew quite a bit, and so I would always win this discussion. It was kind of a no-brainer, but I was paying them by the hour to sit and listen to me, so we'd talk till noon sometimes.
Captive audience.
Exactly, and so it was not very fruitful at all in those years. Once I learned to share my faith with people, between my wife and I, within the first 30 days, we led 30 people to the Lord.
Wow.
I never imagined in a lifetime I'd see that happening.
Wow.
And so it really got me excited and began to realize that, God, have you got something else in mind here? I'm enjoying what I'm doing. It was starting to take off. In fact, the last year or so in the business, I was probably 6 months behind in orders. Trying to keep up.
Wow.
And so it
wasn't an easy decision to step into a new thing. When you're being successful, it's very hard to step into something new.
We worked hard to get it to that point, and it was just beginning to really start to show some progress in a more of a significant way. But yeah, it was a decision. But we realized that what is life really all about, and is this the most important thing we can do? It was interesting, we used to go to trade shows to sell our carvings, and I was at a trade show one time and taking a break from the booth where we were set up, and I was walking around and looking at all this stuff, and I remember saying to myself, junk. All this stuff's going to burn up someday. And God just stopped me, literally, physically stopped me right in the middle of it. In fact, the guy walking behind me bumped into me, stopped so suddenly. And God said, you remember your carvings are made of wood.
Wow.
They're going to burn up someday too.
Wow.
And so I thought, wow, yeah, that's right. It's all going to burn up someday. Will it really matter? And so God began to, that was one step along the way in just showing me
so
that
a real
there's
shift
more to
into
life.
an eternal perspective.
It was.
What's going to last in eternity, what's going to last. So what were the practical steps that happened in your life then? How did you transition out of business into your next step of life?
Okay, well, we applied to join the staff of Campus Crusade for Christ.
Okay.
But that meant we needed to do something with our business and our home and so on. And there was nothing happening in Ontario at that time where we lived, so we needed to move to BC to the headquarters. And so all of this had to be sold. That in itself was kind of interesting. I had 3 men actually came. The first 2 came. They were not believers. They came to work with me. They wanted to have some kind of an art type of business. And so I said, well, I don't want you to just take it and hope it works. But let's work with me. I'm way behind in orders. Come work with me, and if that works out and you enjoy it, then what we can do is we'll transition it over to you. And interestingly enough, both of these men became believers just working alongside me, trying to see if this is something they wanted. And it was almost word for word. They both said the same thing. Al, I don't need your business. I found what I was looking for. So okay, what's this? What's going on here, God? Maybe this is my ministry. I even thought that yeah, maybe I'll spend the rest of my life just selling my business. That could be my ministry. But anyway, that eventually a friend of ours bought the business, and a home and everything. And we were able to move on. So.
Wow. So how long did you stay with Campus Crusade?
Actually, 15 years. Those were good years. We saw some very good things happening there. A very exciting time.
And you did a lot of international ministry at that time, didn't you?
I did some, mostly in Canada, but I did go with the Jesus film to various places, Mexico and Brazil.
Okay.
Took a couple of teams. One was a group of pastors we took down to Brazil, and that was great experience. We went on river boats, slept in hammocks on these river boats.
Wow.
And everything was a lot of fun.
Wow.
But we saw an amazing number of people come to Christ, and you were usually there for about 10 days or so, but we saw probably 8,000 to 12,000 people receive Christ during those times.
That's just fantastic.
It was very, very exciting.
The Jesus film has really made a difference, hasn't it?
God has used it amazingly, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
It's one thing of interest, though, and this has to do with kind of, again, another step in the progress or whatever, God's journey for me. While I was excited to see all these people come to Christ, I had actually been to Mexico City, a very large city. I think at that time around 19 million people. I think it's over 30 now.
That's crazy.
But huge city, and you couldn't see it all because the smog was so bad. But as far as you could see, you knew it just went on and on and on, almost forever. But anyway, we were there, and I was paired up with a pastor who had a small church, 18 to 20 people I think he had in his church. And we showed the Jesus film, just hung up a sheet in the middle of the street, and they could view it from both sides, sort of thing. It was a great time. And we saw a lot of people come to Christ, and just from that little church, I think we probably gave them about 300 response cards.
Amazing.
And so anyway, as God had planned, I'm sure, 3 years later, I was back in Mexico, and as it so happened, I was paired up with the same pastor again. And I thought, well, this is going to be exciting. I can hardly wait to meet him and see how his church has grown and what's been happening. And so we went out to his church and met the pastor and got talking. And I learned that he'd had, I think it was 3 or 4 other film showings in the meantime, in those 3 years. And so I said, well, how are you doing? How's the church going? Well, I found out that the church was still 18 to 20 people.
Wow.
Well, it broke my heart.
Yeah.
It really did. I remember I wept. I literally wept going back to our accommodation where we were staying that night. I was in the back of a pickup truck, and I was looking out over the city, and I was just thinking, God, there's something's not right here. This is great. I'm glad these people receive Christ, and I'm not saying this in any way negative about what Crusade's doing. That Jesus, it's a wonderful thing God's using, but he was beginning to kind of burn into my heart a new vision, a new passion. And again, I cried out, and I said, God, what's missing? What are we missing here? Because, we could come back here 100 times, 1,000 times, and we would never reach everyone in Mexico, Mexico City.
I've heard someone say, Jesus didn't call us to go make decisions, but to go make disciples.
Exactly.
And of course, the decision is an important part of it, but it doesn't end at that initial birth. Just like the birth of a baby doesn't end there. There has to be growth. There has to be maturity. And is that the vision that God planted in your heart at that time?
It was a part of it, for sure. Yes, we need to see more than just people receive Christ. Those who receive Christ need to go on and reach their family and friends.
Oh, okay.
And if they don't do that, then there's probably no way that we can show enough Jesus films showings
Right.
to reach all of just Mexico City. And so God began to say, all right, we're looking into something new here. And that was the beginning of the real vision for the ministry of Dynamic Churches International, is that we've got to equip the churches to produce reproducing disciples.
To multiply.
To multiply out and more and more and more and more, and exponentially to eventually reach their sphere of influence, each one.
So making disciples who make disciples who make disciples who
On
make
and on and
disciples.
on,
Yeah, and well, you've been very successful. God has used you mightily in that. Now, where did you go from there? How did you then evolve out of the Campus Crusade ministry into Dynamic Churches International?
Okay, well, I started business pretty well right out of high school, so I wasn't theologically trained, and but I knew that the church had to be the vehicle through which God could do His work. There's the parachurch groups are good, and they're usually more outreach oriented. But the church has to finish the picture, as it were, and that is where I began to realize I needed church experience. So my pastor at that time had been asking me to come on staff. It's had a couple of times, and so I went and approached him. I says, "Are you serious about that? Because I'd like to come on." It was with the Sherwood Park Alliance Church here in Alberta, Sherwood Park, Alberta, and so we joined the staff. I was involved primarily there in giving leadership to the adult ministries, college and career up to adults. And so I got some good, excellent church experience.
So you wanted to ground yourself in the kind of life and ministry that you were going to then be reaching out to people who were involved in that kind of life and ministry.
Right, yeah. And I thought, well, the church experience would help me to take it to other churches from there.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
So I was there 3 years, 81 to 84, 1981 to 84. And we actually saw the ministry grow. We saw the small groups start at that church. We went up to about 30 groups. I wish I knew then what I know now. It would have,
Don't we all?
I would have been able to see those groups multiply.
Right.
I didn't really see a lot of that. We started new groups, and that was good. But hey, we can do a lot better than that for sure now.
Yeah, well, good. So what, after those 3 years, what was the impetus that now it was time to begin your own ministry and to take this vision into many churches?
Well, I actually went back with Campus Crusade for a few years.
Okay.
I think 3 or 4 years again. And at that time, I became exposed to a ministry in the U.S. called Church Dynamics. And they were making disciples. They were doing some of the things that God was beginning to build a passion for me. And so I actually brought that in, through Campus Crusade, brought that into Canada. And we began doing that initially. But then, a number of things began to change. I began to realize that God was saying, you need to get out and just do this. That was a pretty bold, scary step at the time. 2 other men that I knew joined with me at that time, John Dewick and Eldon Babcock. Eldon was a church planter. John was a businessman. We'd worked together somewhat with Campus Crusade, and so as we shared the vision of what we wanted to do, they began to say, "Yes, let's do it."
Wow!
And so we started the ministry, and it was pretty scary. It was actually a very interesting time in our life because we left Campus Crusade on the 15th of July in 1989, and the plan to start the ministry on the 1st of August. And 7 days, right in the middle of that time, that 2-week time period, our youngest daughter and her husband were in a very serious accident, a motorcycle accident. And it was very touch and go there, especially for him. But they both had a lot of broken bones and just really, really banged up out in the mountains. And they went into a ditch and crashed into a bunch of big square boulders at the bottom of the mountain. It was a very, very difficult time. It looked at one point like our daughter might have to have her leg amputated, actually. And that was a very puzzling time for me. I remember crying out to God, saying, what's going on here? Are you punishing me or what? I mean, that's how I felt. To be honest, that's how I felt that one day. And I just said, God, what am I doing? And I think as I look, even at the time, but certainly as I look back on it, I think what God was saying was, Al, if you think you're going to go off and do this ministry, forget it. this is simply going to be you being available for me to do it.
Wow.
And he literally immobilized me for a number of weeks there. And yet God was doing works, preparing the groundwork for this ministry to begin.
That is amazing.
And as it did, he took it and has blessed ever since. You know, even from the beginning of Dynamic Churches, I think he made it very clear to me that I would be very much behind the scenes. I'm not going to be an upfront kind of a big evangelist kind of guy. I'll be just there as an encourager and a support person to pastors, ministry leaders, missionaries, whoever, to help them have a ministry. And this ministry is about helping them have a dynamic ministry.
Wow, that is awesome. This is really exciting stuff. We'll come back in a few minutes and talk more about what Dynamic Churches International is, how it operates, and what God is doing through it.
All right, great.
Days.
Thank you.
So join us in a few moments as we return in conversation with Al Middleton.